Hey biology, another video today to take you through the first parts of photosynthesis. So I'll put a minute up for you to kind of gather your materials and get ready for class, and then we'll get right to it. So today we're going to start talking about photosynthesis. The whole point of photosynthesis is actually to make sugar, to make a simple sugar called glucose. Plants do this by using sunlight, of course. We know photosynthesis has to do with sunlight. In fact, the word photosynthesis actually means to make using light. Photo is light, synthesis is to put together. But they have to use some materials to put that sugar together, and sunlight is really just the energy. It drives the whole reaction. So the things that they use are carbon dioxide, which we usually abbreviate as CO2, and water, which of course we know is H2O. So the plant is going to take in carbon dioxide, it's going to take in water, then sunlight is going to drive the reaction, and what you get out is sugar, glucose. Glucose is a simple sugar, and then those glucose molecules are going to be put together to make more and more complex sugars. And the whole point of glucose is that it is a good way to store energy. It's a food that our mitochondria then can use. We talked about in cellular structure how mitochondria break down glucose and make ATP. So this is kind of basically the plant is making kind of a currency that can be used as far as energy goes in the form of the glucose, which then can be exchanged later for ATP in the mitochondria. Now, the other thing that we know is that plants give off oxygen. Oxygen gas, or O2, is given off as a byproduct or as waste. Of course, that oxygen gas is pretty important to us. We have to breathe that in, and plants actually will use oxygen too when they break the glucose back down. But in the whole realm of photosynthesis, it just kind of comes out as a byproduct. Okay, here is the equation for photosynthesis. So here we see the carbon dioxide and the water. We add those together. Light is used as the energy to drive the reaction. We get out the sugar glucose. So C6H12O6 is just the chemical formula for glucose, and then we get out oxygen. But the thing I want you to focus on here is to make a single glucose molecule. So this is only one molecule right here. It takes 6 carbon dioxides and 6 water molecules. So it's going to have to take in 6 of each of those different molecules to make a single glucose. And then the way it works out, you get 6 oxygens out as well. So it's a pretty easy equation to kind of remember, because all the other materials have 6's in front of them, but you get 1 glucose, and we're going to have to learn how that entire process works. Now, photosynthesis, of course, takes place in the chloroplast. So we looked at a chloroplast a little bit when we studied cellular structure, but we're going to look at it a little bit more in depth today. So the chloroplast has an inner membrane and an outer membrane. So we say it's a double-membraned structure. That means that the chloroplast can kind of keep its processes of doing the photosynthesis separate from the other things that are going on inside the plant cell. Now we should pause here and say that there are other organisms that can do photosynthesis. There are some protists that can, some bacteria are able to. They're going to do a little bit more simple form of it. The way we're going to learn today has more to do with the plants and what happens in the actual chloroplast organelle. Now, we talked about before how in the chloroplast we have these flattened discs that almost look like pancakes called thylakoids. So those are all stacked up, and then in between those thylakoids is a syrupy mixture called the stroma. So we talked about how you have these kind of pancakes with the syrup around, and it's going to be important to keep those separate because some parts of photosynthesis are going to take place in the actual thylakoids, whereas some parts are actually going to take place in the stroma. Now, a stack of thylakoids altogether, like so a whole stack here, is called a granum. So a bunch of thylakoids stacked up, you get a granum. So this shows a little bit more simple setup of the chloroplast. You can see the main parts, the stroma, the stacks of the thylakoids, which we call the granum. And it's actually in the thylakoids that we find something called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is going to be the molecule, the pigment, that is actually able to absorb sunlight. So when sunlight comes in and strikes the leaf of the plant, or the green part of the plant, those light waves are going to travel through the cells, and they're going to strike the thylakoid part of the chloroplast, and they're going to be absorbed by the chlorophyll. So that special pigment is important, and because without it, the light would actually probably just travel through and it wouldn't get absorbed. And the sunlight absorption is an important part of the whole photosynthesis process. So we'll look at the chlorophyll a little bit more further down the road. What I want to talk about now are the stages of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis basically happens in 3 stages. And we're going to talk about stage 1 a little bit more today, but then we'll cover stages 2 and 3 tomorrow. So the first stage of photosynthesis is we want to capture energy from light. Okay, the light wave is going to interact with the leaf, it's going to hit the thylakoids, and it's going to get absorbed by the chlorophyll. So we can kind of think of this in terms of chlorophyll absorption. And we're going to look at that a little bit more in depth, how that actually works after we've kind of gone through these other stages, or at least laid them out. The second part of photosynthesis is that we need to convert that energy to ATP. Okay, so we've talked about ATP last week, understand the structure of that, how it can store energy, but we need to make that ATP so that it can actually be used to do something useful. So the light energy is going to be captured in the chlorophyll, but that's not really going to do anything unless we can put it into a usable form. So the energy is going to be converted to ATP in something that we call the electron transport chain. And tomorrow we'll be learning more about the electron transport chain and what actually happens there. Then the third step is to take that ATP that we've made and use it to make the glucose. So the ATP that was created and put together in step 2 is then going to be used as fuel to actually put glucose together. And that is a process that we call the Kelvin cycle. We call it that after a guy with an awesome name, Melvin Kelvin. He was the first scientist to actually describe how the Kelvin cycle worked. Okay, and the other thing that we should kind of throw in here is the first 2 stages. So stage 1 and stage 2 all happen in the thylakoid. But the actual making of the glucose production, happens in the stroma. So all of photosynthesis takes place inside the chloroplast, but the first 2 stages are going to happen in those flat discs whereas the actual glucose putting together happens in that syrupy stuff in between. Before we can talk more about stage 1, we need to look at chlorophyll a little bit more. So there's actually two types of chlorophyll. There's chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. And here's the molecular structure for each. And as you can see, they're pretty big, complex molecules. There's a lot of carbon bonds there, of course. It's organic molecules. What's interesting is there's a magnesium atom right in the middle of it. That's important in the actual light capturing of the pigment. This is what actually does the light absorbing in the plant. So this graph shows how much light is going to be absorbed by each of those different pigments based on the color of light that comes in. So when light comes from the sun, we see it as kind of a white light, but it's actually lots of different colors all mixed together. Okay? You see that in a rainbow. When sunlight goes through a rainbow, we see the colors as they get spread out from orange all the way to, red all the way to violet. And so the violet and purple color is going to be down here, and then we see the red right here. Now if we look at chlorophyll A, it does a really good job of absorbing red light, or a pretty good job anyway. The absorbance for it kind of spikes in that red area. And then if we follow it along, this is A over here as well, it's pretty good at picking up the violet light as well, the purple. So that one molecule is going to absorb red light and purple light pretty well. Chlorophyll B, on the other hand, is going to be more towards the orange part of the spectrum. And here, that's where it's going to peak. And it's going to be a little bit better at doing the blue part. So these two molecules are complementary. They're going to soak up, some of the wavelengths of light that the other one can't a little bit better, and that is going to make it so that we get more light, more energy that's absorbed. Because if we just had one of those molecules, there'd be a lot of energy that went through the plant and didn't get absorbed. And one thing that's interesting is that neither chlorophyll A or chlorophyll B are particularly good at absorbing green light. So green light doesn't get soaked up by the plant. And that seems a little weird until you really stop and think about it. For us to see something, light has to bounce off of it. So if I look at, say, the red hula hoop hanging on the wall up here, light is hitting that red hula hoop, the red light bounces off and goes into my eye, and that's why I see it as red. The other colors either are scattered or they're absorbed. So when we look at green plants, we see all this green plants. It only looks green because the green light really isn't interacting with the plant at all. Plants don't like green light. So it bounces off, and we see them as green because they're not using it. So the green light's actually wasted. Okay, now chlorophyll is the main pigment that we hear about, but there are a couple of other pigments that we have in plants. They're not as abundant in the leaves, but they're still there. So there's things called carotenoids. And then there's anthocyanins. And carotenoids and anthocyanins are the pigments that we tend to see in the fall time. So now, right now it's fall. We're kind of actually a little bit past it for this area. But in the fall time, what plants do is they stop producing chlorophyll. And the chlorophyll, as it soaks up sunlight, actually will start to break down. So if a plant isn't replacing the chlorophyll continuously, then that chlorophyll isn't going to be in the chloroplast anymore, and it's not going to be soaking up those rays of light. And so what we tend to see when the chlorophyll goes away is the carotenoids and the anthocyanin pigments that are left behind. And that's why we get the fall colors. The oranges and the reds and the yellows have to do with the mixtures of those pigments that are left behind once the chlorophylls are kind of breaking down. Now these pigments do help to soak up sunlight. So this graph shows, we already talked about chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. We see the carotenoids here are going to get a little bit of that kind of blue-green light of the spectrum. So they're going to soak up a little bit of the light that chlorophylls miss. But because it's not as common in the leaves, there's not as much of it in the leaves, it's not near as important in the whole photosynthesis process. The chlorophyll is going to be the main thing that's important in photosynthesis. In fact, the carotenoids tend to work a little bit more about soaking up some energy just so that the plant doesn't get heated up, kind of almost like an anti-sunburn. Okay, let's talk about stage 1. So remember, stage 1 happens in the thylakoid. So this is going to happen, the chlorophyll is actually in those flattened discs in the thylakoid, and the sunlight is going to come and strike the chlorophyll there. So the first thing that happens, of course, is that light hits the chlorophyll. So it hits those chlorophyll molecules, and then we should say that some, underline some, colors are absorbed. Okay. And you can probably understand this effect if you've ever walked outside on a sunny day with a dark t-shirt on. When light gets absorbed by things, it's going to transfer energy to them. Now, in that case, we're getting heat energy that's being transferred. And that's what would happen here if there wasn't some mechanism to transfer that energy into a different kind. So instead of heating the plant up, or heating the chlorophyll up, I guess, because we're talking about that molecule, what happens is there's an electron. There's an electron in the chlorophyll atom that is able to jump out. So the second part here is that the energy, we'll draw an arrow from the light because that's where it comes from, the energy bounces an electron out of the molecule. And this process here has a scientific term. We call it the photoelectric effect. Photo meaning light, electric as far as the electron. And a little side note, this is what Albert Einstein actually won his Nobel Prize in describing the photoelectric effect. Now, he didn't do anything with plants. It wasn't realized until later that the photoelectric effect was what was happening inside the chlorophyll. He described it in a certain experiment where they shone light on a piece of metal. But Einstein is actually connected to photosynthesis through that understanding of the photoelectric effect. So this diagram kind of shows what's happening here. Here's the light coming in, right here. It's a little bit hard to see. But the light comes in, it strikes the chlorophyll molecules. So these aren't thylakoids, these are the chlorophyll molecules in a single thylakoid. And that electron starts bouncing from thing to thing. Now that's going to start describing what we're going to talk about in stage 2 tomorrow. But the important part here is that light comes in, an electron jumps out of one molecule, and then it'll be able to go from molecule to molecule down what we call the electron transport chain. Okay, for homework, do 4.2. I won't actually stamp that until next week, but I will go over the answers in class tomorrow. So I guess it's kind of up to you if you want to wait till then. I'll never know. But it would be a lot better practice for the test if you tried to get the right answers and then see where your mistakes are. So do that. I'll put up your question of the day. Make sure you hand that in.